Welcome back to Wings of Defiance, the channel that believes the most important part of any aircraft isn't the wings, the engine, or the weapons. It's the soul of the engineer who refused to quit. We are obsessed with the next big thing. We love the sleek, the fast, the invisible, the fighters that cost $1 billion apiece. We are sold a story of innovation that looks like a clean room, a wind tunnel, and a perfect computer simulation. But history shows us that's a lie. True, battlefield-winning innovation is almost never clean. It's ugly, it's desperate, it's born from grease, from frustration, and from the gut-wrenching reports of pilots who are dying because the perfect machine failed them. Tonight, we're telling the story of an engineer who was tasked with building a race car but instead delivered a tractor. He was given a checklist for a thoroughbred, and he designed a mule. His superiors, the brightest minds in aeronautics, the men with stars on their shoulders, looked at his design, and they didn't just reject it. They laughed at it. They called it inefficient, obsolete, an aerodynamic nightmare. They called it, in no uncertain terms, broken. But that broken design, born from one man's stubborn refusal to ignore the truth, would go on to save more lives, serve in more conflicts, and become the most beloved, most reliable, and most essential aircraft in the entire inventory. This is how one engineer's broken design turned into the backbone of America's Air Force. Before we get this bird in the air, if you believe these stories of the unsung, stubborn, brilliant mavericks deserve to be told, I need you to join the squadron. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a mission. Second, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this history matters and that the engineers in the background deserve the spotlight. And finally, drop a comment below. Let us know what country and city you are watching from. It's always incredible to see our global wingmen checking in. The year was 1964. The place was the Pentagon, but the problem was 8,000 miles away, stewing in the humid triple canopy jungles of Vietnam. The United States Air Force was in the middle of a glorious high-speed identity crisis. We were the nation that had broken the sound barrier, the nation that built the X-15, the nation with the sleek nuclear-armed B-58 Hustler and the world-beating F-4 Phantom. Our entire doctrine, our whole identity, was built on speed. We were the Air Force, a service of silver jets designed to fight a high-altitude, high-tech war against the Soviet Union over the plains of Europe. But the pilots dying in Southeast Asia weren't dying at 40,000 feet. They were dying at 400 feet, being shot out of the sky by 12.7mm machine guns mounted on the back of trucks. The only plane that could do the job, the only aircraft that could get low and slow enough to actually help the terrified 19-year-old infantryman on the ground, was the A-1 Sky Raider, a piston-engine, tail-dragging World War II-era propeller plane. It was a 20-year-old antique, and we were losing them and their brave pilots at an unsustainable rate. The Air Force brass, men who lived and breathed jet fuel, knew they needed a replacement. So, in their infinite wisdom, they issued a request for a new attack aircraft, and that request was a perfect reflection of their confused, jet-obsessed minds. It demanded high subsonic speeds, advanced targeting pods, a state-of-the-art radar, and the ability to operate from established clean concrete air bases. In essence, they were asking for a smaller, cheaper F-4. They were asking for a sports car to do a plumbing job. In a small, windowless office in the sub-basement of the Tactical Air Command building, a man named David Davey Heller read this request, and he just shook his head. Heller was not an aerodynamicist, not in the classical sense. He didn't have a wall of PhDs from Caltech. He was a structural engineer. A bridge man, as the jet jockey crowd called him. He was a man who understood dirt, loads, stress, and failure. His job was to analyze crash reports, to figure out why a wing spar had snapped, why a landing gear had collapsed. And for the last 2 years, he had been reading, with a growing sense of horror, the after-action reports from Vietnam. He wasn't just reading data, he was reading the last words of pilots. Hit from ground fire, lost hydraulics, no manual reversion, ejecting. Engine ingested debris on takeoff from Bien Hoa, flamed out. Fire in the starboard engine, couldn't punch out. Controls unresponsive. Took a 50 cal round through the cockpit floor. I'm bleeding out. These reports were his Bible. They were his gospel of truth, and they told him a story that was completely at odds with what the generals upstairs thought they needed. The pilots weren't asking for speed. They were asking for time. Loiter time. Time to hang over a firefight, to be a guardian angel. They were asking for armor. They were asking for a plane that could get its wing shot full of holes and keep flying. They were asking for engines that wouldn't suck up a rock and disintegrate. They were asking for simplicity. They were asking for a plane that could be fixed with a hammer and a wrench on a muddy, rain-soaked airstrip, not a clean room. So, David Heller, the bridge builder, the man who understood failure better than anyone, took the Air Force's official request, and he threw it in the trash. He tacked a blank sheet of vellum to his drafting board. He wasn't going to design what the generals wanted. He was going to design what the pilots needed. He started with the pilot. He drew a man, and then he drew a box around him. A bathtub, he called it, made of thick, heavy titanium armor. A box that could stop a 23mm cannon shell. He built the entire airplane around this concept. Pilot survival, above all else. Then, the engines. He didn't pick sleek, powerful, thirsty turbojets. He picked 2 turboprop engines, the kind you'd see on a cargo plane. Why? Because they were ridiculously fuel efficient. They could sip fuel, giving his plane an absurd 10-hour loiter time. They could burn almost any fuel you could find. And crucially, they weren't delicate. They could ingest mud, leaves, and shrapnel and just keep spinning. He placed them high on the wings, far from the ground, so they wouldn't suck up rocks on a dirt runway. The wings. Oh, the wings. The generals wanted thin, swept-back wings for speed. Heller drew straight wings. Long, broad, straight, and ridiculously thick. They were ugly. They were obsolete. They were the wings of a 1940s bomber. And they were perfect. They were so thick, they could be shot full of holes and their main spar would still be intact. They were so long, they generated enormous lift, allowing the plane to carry an insane 16,000 pounds of bombs, more than a B-17. And they allowed the plane to fly slowly, to turn on a dime, to loiter at 150 miles an hour, giving the pilot all the time in the world to find his target. He added redundant, triple redundant, manual flight controls. If all the hydraulics were shot out, the pilot could still fly the plane with simple brute force steel cables like a WWI biplane. He designed a landing gear that looked like it belonged on a dump truck, a massive, oversized, ridiculous thing that could absorb the shock of landing on a bombed-out road, a patch of grass, anything. And then, the gun. The other designs had pods, or small 20mm cannons. Heller designed the entire nose of the aircraft to be a single, massive 7-barrel 30mm Gatling gun. A gun so large, so powerful, that it fired shells the size of milk bottles. A gun that was, in essence, the airplane's main purpose. The plane was built around the gun. For 6 months, he worked in secret, perfecting his design. He called it the AX, for Attack Experimental. His few colleagues who saw the blueprints just laughed. They called it Davy's Tractor. It was pug-nosed. It was squat. It was angular. It was, by every known standard of 1960s aeronautics, the ugliest, most backward-looking, most broken design they had ever seen. But Heller knew he was right. He submitted it. He managed to get a 10-minute presentation slot in front of the Tactical Air Command Procurement Board. The room was dark, paneled in rich mahogany, smelling of cigar smoke and old money power. At the head of the table sat General Marcus Lacroix, a man who had flown P-51s over Germany, commanded the first Sabre jet wings in Korea, and was the spiritual father of the faster, higher Air Force. Heller, in his rumpled suit, his hands stained with graphite, put his first slide on the projector. It was a side profile of his tractor. A quiet, deadly snicker rippled through the room. "Mr. Heller," Lacroix said, his voice a smooth, aristocratic baritone. "You must be joking. You're presenting a turboprop in 1964? Sir, the loiter time and fuel efficiency are—" "The loiter time is irrelevant," Lacroix cut him off. "The mission is to get in, destroy the target, and get out before the enemy can react. This thing is a sitting duck. It's slower than the Sky Raider you're supposed to be replacing." He pointed a gold-plated pen at the screen. "And these wings, they're straight. They're not even swept. This is a design from 1945. It's an aerodynamic nightmare. It's a barn door. What is its maximum speed?" Heller's blood ran cold. He knew this was the trap. "At sea level, sir. About 450 miles an hour." The laughter was no longer quiet. It was open, derisive, and humiliating. A 2-star general in the back actually guffawed. 450? Lacroix said, a look of profound, theatrical pity on his face. "Son, we have helicopters that can nearly do that. The Soviets have trainers that are faster. You have designed an aircraft that cannot fight, and it cannot run. It can only die." "But the armor, sir," Heller pleaded, his voice cracking. "The pilot survivability are the redundant controls. The armor," Lacroix said, his voice turning to ice, "is a symptom of the disease. A properly designed aircraft doesn't need armor. It uses speed and altitude as its defense. Your design, it's fundamentally completely broken." It is an admission of failure. It is a philosophy of failure. It is slow, it is ugly, and it invites the enemy to shoot at it. We are the United States Air Force, Mr. Heller. We do not build targets. Get this embarrassment out of my briefing room. Your submission is rejected. Heller stood there, his face burning, the laughter of the generals echoing in his ears. He collected his slides, his hands shaking with a rage so deep it made him dizzy. They were wrong. They were all wrong. They were so blinded by their own dogma, their love of speed, that they were willing to send more pilots to die in fragile, advanced jets that weren't built for the real war. He walked out of that room, but he wasn't defeated. He was enraged. He was certain. They had called his design broken. They had called it a failure. He went back to his tiny office, unrolled his broken blueprints, and in the bottom corner, he wrote a new, unofficial project name. He called it the Warthog, and he swore to himself, to the pilots whose reports he read every night, that he would find a way to build it, or he would die trying. David Heller's rejection was total and absolute. In the sleek, jet-powered world of the 1960s Air Force, his Warthog wasn't just the wrong answer. It was a joke. It was an insult to the very idea of progress. Any other engineer would have quietly filed the blueprints in a drawer labeled career-ending mistakes and moved on, perhaps to designing a more aerodynamic fairing for a fuel tank or a more efficient cockpit layout for the F-4. To continue pushing the design was not just insubordination, it was professional suicide. General Lacroix had made it clear. The future was fast, but Heller was a different kind of engineer. He wasn't fueled by a desire for promotion. He was haunted by the crash reports. He was a man possessed by the ghosts of dead pilots, and their final, frantic radio calls were a truth that was more powerful than any general's laugh. So, he didn't quit. He went underground. He kept his head down, performing his official duties as a structural analyst with dull bureaucratic competence. But his nights, his weekends, his entire soul belonged to the Warthog. He knew he couldn't win a head-to-head fight with the jet mafia. He couldn't win on performance, on speed, or on beauty. He had to win on a metric they despised but couldn't ignore: cost and survivability. While the big-name contractors were busy drafting their sleek twin-jet afterburning mini Phantoms for the official AX competition, Heller was refining his broken design. He recognized a fatal flaw in his own presentation. He had used turboprops. It was a bridge too far. It was a visual, visceral link to the past, to the Sky Raider, that the generals just couldn't stomach. It looked like a World War II plane. Fine, he muttered to himself in his basement office, his pencil flying across the vellum. You want jets? I'll give you jets, but I'll do it my way. He erased the two propeller engines, but where to put the new jet engines? The other competitors were putting them in the fuselage, or in sleek pods under the wings, just like an F-4. That was the clean way to do it. That was also, as Heller knew from his reports, the stupid way to do it. An engine under the wing was a vacuum cleaner for rocks, mud, and debris on a rough field takeoff. A single lucky burst of 23 mm shrapnel could rip through the fuselage and take out both engines or sever the fuel lines. It was efficient, but it was fragile. Heller's solution was, like the rest of his plane, ugly, broken, and absolutely brilliant. He put the engines on top of the fuselage at the rear of the plane, nestled between the two vertical stabilizers of a split tail. It was an engineer's nightmare. It created massive aerodynamic drag. It was complex to mount. It was, in a word, inefficient. And it was perfect. Up there, they were almost impossible to clog with ground debris. They were shielded from ground fire from almost every angle except a direct overhead pass. And most importantly, they were separate. A hit on one engine would have zero effect on the other. A catastrophic failure wouldn't set the fuselage on fire. He'd created maximum survivability at the cost of maximum performance. It was a trade-off the jet mafia would never, ever make. He didn't just move the engines, he doubled down on everything else. He thickened the titanium bathtub. He added redundant manual control cables in separate shielded bundles running down opposite sides of the fuselage. An enemy would have to saw the plane in half to sever them both. He designed the main landing gear to protrude slightly from the wings, even when retracted, so that in a belly landing the gear, not the fuselage, would take the impact. He designed the wings so they could be interchangeable, left for right, slashing repair time and the need for a massive parts inventory. Every single decision he made was driven by the reports from Vietnam. Every choice was a middle finger to the doctrine of higher, faster. His plane was a flying tank, a repairman's dream, and a pilot's last-ditch insurance policy. It was still the Warthog, just with two high-mounted jets, but a drawing, no matter how brilliant, is just paper. Heller knew he was dead in the water without a sponsor, a graybeard with enough rank to protect him. He found his angel in the most unlikely of places, the U.S. Army. While the Air Force was obsessed with high-altitude strategic bombing and dogfighting, the Army was the one on the ground, the one actually getting shot at. They were desperate for close air support, CAS, for a plane that could act like flying artillery, a guardian angel that would stay on station, take a beating, and kill the tanks and machine gun nests that were chewing up their soldiers. The Army had seen Heller's initial turboprop design. It had been leaked by a sympathetic colonel, and they had fallen in love with it. They didn't care that it was slow. They cared that it had a 10-hour loiter time and was built around a cannon that could kill a T-54 tank. The problem? The Army wasn't allowed to fly fixed-wing combat aircraft. A 1948 agreement gave that mission to the Air Force. This inter-service rivalry was the crack in the wall that Heller needed. The Army, in a brilliant bureaucratic maneuver, began to pour its research money into a new attack helicopter, the Cheyenne. But they wrote the specifications for the Cheyenne in a way that was almost impossible to meet, all while quietly funding studies into fixed-wing alternatives. They were, in effect, trying to blackmail the Air Force. Their unspoken message was, if you don't build us the CAS plane we actually need, we will defy the 1948 agreement and build it ourselves. Suddenly, General Lacroix and the jet mafia had a problem. They didn't want Heller's slow-moving Warthog, but they hated the idea of the Army getting its own Air Force even more. The Warthog, which had been an embarrassment, was suddenly a political necessity. It was the lesser of two evils, the ugly, unwanted child the Air Force had to adopt to keep the Army out of its airspace. In 1966, the AX program was officially, though very quietly, reopened. But this time, the request wasn't written by the fighter pilots. It was written by Heller's allies, the Forward Air Controllers, FACs, and the Army's ground pounders. The new request was a direct copy of Heller's broken philosophy. It demanded a massive cannon. It demanded a 30,000-pound takeoff weight. It demanded extreme pilot survivability, massive ordnance load, and the ability to operate from rough, forward airstrips. The requirements for high speed? They were gone, replaced by a new critical metric, low speed. The plane had to be stable enough to maneuver at 150 miles an hour, to turn tightly inside a single valley. The entire dogma of the Air Force had been turned on its head, not by an engineer, but by the bloody reality of a jungle war and a brilliant inter-service knife fight. General Lacroix was furious. He had been outmaneuvered. He was now forced to build the very plane he had personally ridiculed and rejected. He couldn't kill the program, but he could still try to kill Heller's design. He ensured the AX competition was open to everyone, and the giants came running. Northrop submitted a beautiful, sleek, twin-jet design, the YA-9. It was fast, it was modern, and it was everything the jet mafia wanted. It was the pretty airplane. And then there was Heller. He had no billion-dollar corporation. He was just an engineer with a blueprint. But he had a patron. He had quietly partnered with Fairchild Republic, a company that had a long, distinguished history of building rugged, ugly, and effective attack planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt. They saw Heller's blueprints, and they didn't laugh. They saw the ghost of their own legendary design philosophy. They saw a winner. Fairchild Republic, with Heller as the chief design consultant, built his plane. They built the Warthog. They built the YA-10. When the two prototypes were rolled out for the official head-to-head fly-off in 1972, the contrast was almost a joke. The Northrop YA-9 was beautiful. It was sleek, with a high wing and engines tucked cleanly into the fuselage. It looked like the future. The YA-10 was David Heller's drawing made real. It was the ugliest aircraft anyone had ever seen. It was squat. The wings were long and straight. The engines were hung on its back like two giant trash cans. The cockpit was offset. The landing gear stuck out. And the gun, the entire nose was just a housing for the massive GAU-8 Avenger, a cannon so enormous that the plane had to be designed around it. Its firing barrel offset from the center line so the recoil wouldn't push the plane off course. It was, as one journalist wrote, a creature only a mother could love. The test pilots, all bred on Phantoms and Starfighters, looked at the two planes. They all wanted to fly the YA-9. The YA-10 was a career killer, a pig, a warthog. The stage was set for Heller's final humiliation. His broken design, which had survived by sheer political luck, was now going to be flown against a faster, sleeker, more Air Force-like competitor. General Lacroix was in the stands, a small, satisfied smile on his face. The real airplane was finally going to put this ugly, ground-bound tractor in its grave, once and for all. The fly-off was set for October 1972 at Edwards Air Force Base, the spiritual home of the faster, higher religion. The audience was a mix of two separate, hostile worlds. On one side, in their crisp blue flight suits and tailored Class A uniforms, sat General Lacroix and the jet mafia from Tactical Air Command. They were there to watch their preferred design, the sleek Northrop YA-9, get its official rubber stamp. On the other side, in sun-faded olive drab fatigues, sat the real customers, a stone-faced delegation of U.S. Army colonels, the ground pounders who had been fighting the inter-service war over close air support, and with them, sitting in the back, was a small, quiet group of men who mattered more than all the generals combined, a handful of combat veteran A-1 Skyraider pilots and forward air controllers, flown in straight from the mud and blood of Southeast Asia. David Heller stood in the back, clutching a plastic cup of coffee, his blueprints a distant memory. He just watched. The Northrop YA-9 went first. It was a beautiful thing, no doubt. It taxied out, its two engines humming a clean, modern, efficient note. It took off with a fighter's grace, its wings swept back, its profile low. It looked fast even when it was standing still. The generals from TSE nodded in approval. The YA-9 performed the first test, a high-speed strafing run. The pilot, a hotshot from the F-4 community, brought it in at 400 knots just as the doctrine demanded. He was a speck, then a roar, then a speck again. He had a firing window of maybe 1.5 seconds to put rounds on target. The 20mm Vulcan cannon fired with its familiar ripping zipper sound and a neat tight burst stitched across the target range. It was a textbook, surgical strike. General Lacroix smiled. The next test was low-speed maneuverability, simulating a re-attack on a target. The pilot slowed the YA-9, but with its small high-speed wings it got mushy. To turn it had to bank hard, bleed energy, and its turning radius was wide, taking it far outside the simulated battle box before it could line up again. The Army colonels watching through binoculars said nothing. Their faces were impassive. The Skyraider pilots in the back just looked at each other, one of them quietly shaking his head. Then, it was Heller's turn. The YA-10 taxied out, and it was an insult to the very concept of aviation. It waddled. Its massive, straight, drooping wings looked like an albatross's. Its two giant, high-mounted engines gave it a bizarre, hunchbacked profile, and the landing gear, bulging from the wings and fuselage, made it look like it was already broken before it took off. The jet mafia openly smirked. One of them called it a triumph of the wrong stuff. The Warthog lined up. The pilot, a grizzled A-1 veteran named Hank Salty Smith, pushed the throttles. The two TF-34 engines spooled up, not with a shriek, but with a deep, powerful, almost industrial groan. The plane didn't leap. It shoved its way into the air. Using its massive wings to generate so much lift, it was airborne in less than a third of the runway, clawing its way up at a steep, defiant angle. The first test was maneuverability. The TAC general in the tower, with a hint of sarcasm, radioed, "YA-10, show us your loiter." "Roger, tower." Salty's voice crackled. He throttled back, and back, and back. The jet, which should have stalled and fallen from the sky, just stopped. Its massive wings and huge flight surfaces bit into the air, and it hung there, stable as a rock, at 130 knots. It wasn't flying, it was prowling. "Show us the turn, Salty," the tower ordered. The YA-10 didn't just bank, it pivoted. Using its massive split aileron decelerons, the plane seemed to wrap itself around an invisible pylon in the sky. It stayed inside the valley, a low, slow, circling predator, its turning radius so tight it could haunt a single square mile of jungle for hours. The Army colonels were no longer impassive. They were leaning forward, binoculars pressed to their faces. The Skyraider pilots were openly grinning. This was their kind of flying. "Okay, Salty," the tower said. "Line up for the gunnery run. Target is the tank armor array." "Roger," Salter replied, his voice chillingly calm. "I'm coming in slow." He lined the ugly, pug-nosed plane up. He wasn't at 400 knots. He was at 180, a sitting duck by General Lacroix's standards. He was giving the enemy all the time in the world to shoot back, and then he pulled the trigger. The sound. That was the moment everything changed. It was not the zip of a 20mm Vulcan. It was a sound that no one on that airfield had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It was a deep, guttural, apocalyptic brrrrt, a low-frequency roar so powerful, it rattled the windows of the control tower a mile away. It was the sound of the Ju-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel cannon the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, firing 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate of 70 rounds per second. The plane was visibly slowed in the air by the gun's 10,000 pounds of recoil, a force greater than one of its own engines. And the target, the row of derelict M48 battle tanks, didn't just get holes in it. It disintegrated. The 3-second burst of fire was a solid liquid stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds that turned hardened steel into a cloud of molten shrapnel. It wasn't a surgical strike. It was an annihilation. When the sound stopped, a profound, stunned, ringing silence fell over the airfield. The army colonels were on their feet. The jet mafia was pale, their mouths hanging open. General Lacroix's smug, satisfied smile was gone, replaced by a mask of chalk-white, utter disbelief. He had just witnessed a barn door erase a tank battalion, but the test wasn't over. The final test, battle damage survivability. The judges, in a gotcha move, ordered both pilots to simulate a catastrophic failure. You've taken a direct hit, single engine, all primary hydraulics. The YA-9 pilot, in his sleek jet, performed a high-speed, controlled touch-and-go, simulating his best-case scenario. When asked what he would really do, he admitted, "I'd be looking for a flat spot to punch out." Then, the order came for Salty in the YA-10. "Roger, tower," he crackled, "shutting down, starboard, engine," and he did. 1,000 feet in the air, he killed one of his engines, and the plane barely noticed. The high-mounted, widely spaced engines meant the asymmetric thrust was minimal. Then he announced, switching to manual reversion. He had shut off all his hydraulics. He was now flying a 35,000-pound jet on nothing but wires and pulleys, just as David Heller, the bridge builder, had designed. The plane, heavy and sluggish, but flying, obeying, continued its approach. It came in, landed hard on its massive, broken landing gear, which didn't just absorb the impact but seemed to mock it. The Warthog, running on one engine with no hydraulics, simply taxied back to the ramp. The competition was over. The YA-9 was a faster, prettier jet, but the YA-10 was a weapon. It was a tractor. It was a tank. It was a survivable, brutal, flying gun. David Heller stood in the back of the observation deck, his coffee long cold. He just watched. He watched the faces of the Army colonels who were now openly applauding. He watched the Sky Raider pilots who were slapping each other on the back. And he watched General Lacroix, who sat down heavily, a man who had just seen the future, and it was slow, ugly, and built like a bridge. The laughter had finally and permanently stopped. The aftermath of the fly-off was not a celebration. It was a ceasefire. The Brart of the Guyot-8 had been a thunderclap that ended the argument, but it didn't win the war. General Lacroix and the TC delegation didn't congratulate Heller, nor did they concede defeat. They simply left. They walked off the observation deck in a tight, silent group, their faces rigid, their briefcases snapping shut. They had come to witness a coronation. Instead, they had witnessed a revolution, and the silence that filled their retreat was louder and more profound than any explosion. David Heller watched them go, the cold desert wind whipping at his rumpled suit. He knew, with a sinking cold certainty, that the fight had just moved from the airfield to the Pentagon. The battle of aerodynamics and steel was over. The war of budgets, politics, and pure, unadulterated dogma was about to begin. Heller was right. Within a week, the smear campaign began, a quiet, insidious effort from within the Air Force's highest levels to kill the YA-10 in its cradle. The official report from the fly-off was a masterpiece of bureaucratic sabotage. It technically, grudgingly admitted that the YA-10 had met or exceeded all test parameters, but the language was poisoned. Where the YA-9's high speed was praised as offering multi-role capability and high survivability through threat avoidance, the YA-10's incredible maneuverability was dismissed as limited to a low-speed, high-risk environment. Its 10-hour loiter time was spun as excessive, leading to pilot fatigue and inefficient asset allocation, and its massive 16,000-pound ordnance load was described as unbalanced for a modern, smart weapon ecosystem. But the most venomous attacks were aimed at Heller's core philosophy. The YA-10 was, in Lacroix's own words in a classified memo, a single-mission anachronism. The future, he argued, was multi-role. The F-16 was already on the drawing boards, a sleek, beautiful fighter that could dogfight and drop bombs. The F-15 was the king of the sky. Why? Lacroix demanded in closed-door budget meetings. Would the Air Force spend billions on a dumb plane that could only kill targets on the ground? And slowly at that, he argued it was a step backward, a betrayal of the Air Force's very identity. He called it a flying tank, and he did not mean it as a compliment. He lobbied Congress to kill the program, to divert its funding to more F-15s, to invest in the future, not the past. He wanted to kill the Warthog, and he was using the one weapon Heller couldn't fight, the budget. Heller, back in his basement office, was no longer just an engineer. He was the unwilling general of a low-level insurgency. He had no access to the four-star meetings or the congressional subcommittees, but he had his allies, and they were the ones who mattered. He had the army, and he had the pilots. The army, furious that their guardian angel was being strangled by the Air Force's jet mafia, went on the offensive. They used their leverage in the Joint Chiefs meetings to champion the A-10. They produced after-action reports from Vietnam that proved high-speed jets were ineffective for CAS, that their bombs were dropped too fast, too high, and too inaccurately. They presented horrifying new intelligence about the Fulda Gap in Germany. The old fear was a jungle war. The new fear was a Soviet armored tidal wave. Thousands of T-62 and new T-72 tanks poised to roll across Europe, an armored fist that no F-4 or F-111, flying at 20,000 feet, could ever hope to stop. "Gentlemen," an Army general famously told a stunned Senate committee, "the F-15 is built to win the war in the air. The A-10 is built to win the war on the ground. And I promise you, if we lose the war on the ground, the war in the air won't matter for very long." Heller's design was no longer a jungle fighter. It was suddenly, and critically, reframed as the only aircraft in the entire Western arsenal designed specifically to kill Soviet tanks in the mud and rain of a European winter. Its broken features were now its greatest strengths. Its slowness, it was patience, the ability to prowl beneath the low, miserable cloud cover of Germany, a place no fast mover could go. Its ugly, straight wings, they were massive hardpoints for a new, revolutionary weapon, the Maverick missile, an anti-tank guided missile that the A-10 could carry in swarms. Its legendary BRT, it was the only airborne gun that could rip through the top armor of a T-72. And its survivability, the titanium bathtub, the redundant controls, the high separate engines, they weren't a flaw, they were a necessity. The only way a pilot could survive the wall of ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft fire that protected every Soviet tank division. While the politicians argued, the pilots and ground crews, the men who had flown the Sky Raiders, the grunts who had watched the fly-off, cemented the plane's identity. The Air Force brass, in a last-ditch effort to make the plane seem respectable, officially designated it the Thunderbolt II, a noble name hearkening back to its P-47 ancestor, another ugly, rugged, and beloved ground pounder. But the crews wouldn't have it. They took one look at its pug nose, its squat landing gear, its bristles, and its low-to-the-ground rooting behavior, and they adopted Heller's old secret nickname. It wasn't the Thunderbolt II. It was, and would forever be, the Warthog. It was an act of love. It was a badge of honor. It was a final middle finger to the jet mafia, who hated it. The name stuck, a perfect, unglamorous but deadly title for a broken plane. In 1974, the war was over. The combination of army pressure, the looming Soviet threat, and the undeniable, logic-defying rightness of Heller's design was too much. General Lacroix, in a quiet, unceremonial meeting, was forced to sign the full-scale production order for the Fairchild Republic A-10A Warthog. The broken design, the aerodynamic nightmare, the sitting duck, had won. It had been rejected, laughed at, and sabotaged at every turn, but it had survived. David Heller was in the room that day, standing in the back, his hands stained with graphite as always. He watched Lacroix sign the paper, his face a mask of cold, forced professionalism. There was no apology, no admission of error, just a signature. But as the general handed the pen back, he looked at Heller, and for a fraction of a second his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, not respect, but understanding. "You built a tractor, Mr. Heller," Lacroix said, his voice just loud enough for Heller to hear. "I still think it's a tractor, but it turns out the world is about to need a lot of plowing done." The 1st Operational Squadron, the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing, stood up at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The pilots were not the sleek, cocky Top Guns. They were the grizzled veterans, the ex-A-1 drivers, the men who understood that flying 150 knots, 500 feet off the ground with your wings on fire, was a different kind of courage. David Heller was invited to their first mass briefing. He sat in the back, a civilian in a room full of green flight suits. The squadron commander, a man who had flown 300 missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in a Sky Raider, stood up. He didn't talk about speed. He didn't talk about multi-role. He put up a slide of a Soviet T-72 tank, and next to it, a slide of Heller's broken wing design. "Gentlemen," the commander said, his voice a low growl, "welcome to the Warthog. Your job is not to win dogfights. Your job is not to look pretty. Your job is to make thunder in the mud. Your job is to kill tanks, and to come home every single time. This is the only plane in the world that can do both. Heller listened, and for the first time he realized his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. He hadn't just built an airplane, he had built a philosophy, and now he had to watch it go to war. The victory in the budget meeting was not a parade, it was a stay of execution. For the next 15 years from the mid-1970s through the 1980s, David Heller's Warthog lived the life of an unloved, unwanted stepchild. While the Air Force was pouring its soul and its billions into the sleek, beautiful, and sexy air superiority fighters, the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the A-10 was relegated to the mud and rain of forward bases in West Germany. Its pilots weren't the Top Gun hotshots. They were the mud movers, a gritty, unglamorous fraternity who practiced flying low and slow, hiding in the miserable European cloud cover. General Lacroix's Jet Mafia still ran the show, and their doctrine of faster, higher, multi-role was the unquestioned religion. The A-10 in their eyes was a single-mission pig, an embarrassment. Its budget was a constant target, its squadrons the first to be threatened with cuts. It was the broken design that had been forced upon them by the Army, and they treated it with a quiet administrative contempt. David Heller, now a senior civilian engineer, watched from the sidelines as his philosophy was, in a way, proven right, but never accepted. The Warthog was a brilliant tractor in an Air Force that only wanted to build race cars. It was a masterpiece of survivability in an era of peace. The Warthog, it seemed, was destined to be a footnote, a niche aircraft designed for a war, a massive head-on Soviet tank invasion that, thankfully, never came. It was succeeding in its mission of deterrence, but it was failing in the one place that mattered to the Pentagon, the battle for prestige. Then, on August 2, 1990, the world changed. Saddam Hussein's massive Soviet-equipped army, the fourth largest in the world, rolled across the border and annihilated Kuwait. This was not a brushfire war. This was it. This was the exact scenario, the very threat that David Heller had built the A-10 to kill. A massive armored tidal wave, a wall of T-72s, T-62s, and BMPs, protected by a dense, lethal umbrella of ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft cannons and mobile SAM launchers. This was the Fulda Gap, but in the desert. As the United States and its allies amassed forces for Operation Desert Storm, the Jet Mafia prepared their war. The F-117 stealth fighters would be the silver bullet to take out command and control. The F-15s would sweep the skies. The F-16s and F-111s would conduct the fast, high-altitude surgical strikes. And the A-10s? They were deployed, almost as an afterthought, to do what they always did, the dirty work. The generals, still disciples of Lacroix's doctrine, planned to use them as fast movers, as bomb trucks, in medium-altitude roles they were never designed for, a plan that would have gotten them slaughtered. But the A-10 pilots, the mud movers, knew better. They knew the plane's soul. They knew, as Heller had known, that the Warthog's armor was not a flaw. It was a weapon. Its slowness was not a weakness. It was patience. The air war began on January 17, 1991. The world watched on CNN as the clean war of smart bombs and green-tinted video feeds unfolded. It was a triumph of the Jet Mafia's vision. But on the ground, in the sand, the real war, the dirty, brutal, tank-killing war had begun, and it was not being fought by the sleek F-16s. It was being fought by the Warthog. The A-10 was unleashed. The pilots, defying the high-altitude orders, dropped down low, low. They came in at 500, then 300, then 100 feet, prowling the desert, hunting. And for the first time in history, the full, unmitigated, terrifying genius of David Heller's broken design was finally, and horribly, proven. All his theories, all the ghosts of Vietnam, were vindicated in a storm of steel and fire. The brrr-t of the GAU-8, once a mere party trick on a test range, became the sound of God's own wrath. It was the sound that Iraqi tank commanders heard in their nightmares. Warthog pilots, flying low, would come upon entire Iraqi armored columns and simply unmake them. The 30mm depleted uranium shells didn't just punch holes. They liquefied the T-72s, ripping them apart in a way that defied physics, turning tanks that had been the terror of the Cold War into smoldering, instantly brewed scrap. The broken, straight wings proved to be the most lethal platform in the theater, carrying such a vast mixed load of Maverick missiles, cluster bombs, and rockets that a single A-10 could, and often did, destroy an entire enemy company on a single pass, then loiter for hours to hunt for more. But the true vindication, the moment that silenced the laughter of the generals forever, was not what the A-10 did to the enemy. It was what the enemy did to the A-10. The Iraqis, stunned, threw everything they had at these low, slow, sitting ducks. They hit them with 23mm cannons. They hit them with 57mm cannons. They hit them with shoulder-fired SAMs. And David Heller's philosophy, his bridge builder mentality, his obsession with redundant, ugly, tough systems caught them. It caught the pilots and it brought them home. The stories became legend, passed from a stunned Air Force to a grateful Army. One A-10, callsign Lead, took a direct hit from an SA-16 missile in the tail. The entire starboard engine was gone. The horizontal stabilizer was shredded. The plane was a mangled wreck, a flying piece of Swiss cheese. The pilot should have been a fireball, but Heller's broken design, his high-mounted separate engines, meant the explosion from one engine didn't touch the other. His redundant vertical stabilizers, which Lacroix had mocked as drag, meant the pilot still had control. His triple redundant hydraulic and manual cable controls meant that even as the fluid bled out, the pilot could still fly. That A-10 flew for another 100 miles, on one engine, with no hydraulics, and landed safely. Another, flown by Captain Kim Campbell, in a later conflict but epitomizing the Gulf War experience, was shredded by AAA. Her canopy was gone, her controls shot to hell. She flew it back for an hour on manual reversion, her head in the 500-knot slipstream, landing a plane that the maintenance crew said had no right to fly. This was the vindication. Every F-16 or F-15 that took a hit like that was a statistic. A pilot floating down under a parachute, a billion-dollar asset lost. Every A-10 that took a hit like that was a story of a pilot climbing, shaken and furious, out of a plane that looked like a scrapyard and walking to the bar for a beer. The Warthog, the sitting duck, had proven to be the most survivable aircraft in the entire war. The ground troops, the Army and the Marines, didn't just respect it, they worshipped it. They didn't pray for the sleek F-16s which were gone in a flash. They prayed for the Warthog. They prayed for that ugly, straight-winged silhouette, for the sound of those two high-mounted engines, a sound that meant the angels had arrived. The A-10 had the highest mission-capable rate, 95.7% of any aircraft in the theater, flew 8,100 sorties, and was officially credited with destroying over 900 Iraqi tanks, 2,000 other military vehicles, and 2,200 artillery pieces. It had, in plain terms, broken the back of the Iraqi army on the ground. David Heller, now in his late 60s, watched the war from his home. He saw the grainy footage of the Highway of Death, a miles-long graveyard of Iraqi armor, a testament to the Burr-T. He saw the interviews with the joyous, tearful Army ground-pounders who spoke of the A-10s as if they were family. He saw, in one brief news clip, an A-10 landing in the twilight, its entire port wing looking like a skeleton, the skin peeled back, the broken main spar still holding. The pilot just taxied in, shut down the one remaining engine, and waved. Heller, the man who had been laughed out of the most powerful rooms in the Pentagon, just sat there, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt the ghosts on his shoulder, the ghosts of the pilots from Vietnam. Finally, rest. General Lacroix's philosophy of failure had, in the crucible of war, been proven to be the only philosophy of survival. The aerodynamic nightmare had been the grunt's sweetest dream. The broken design, the Warthog, the ugly, slow, stubborn single-mission tractor that was laughed at, rejected and sabotaged, had done what no sleek, multi-role fighter could ever do. It had taken the beating, it had killed the tanks, and it had brought its pilots home. It had not just earned its place, it had become the single, undisputed, and immortal backbone of the real United States Air Force.